Tell me when to start. Can we start? Yeah. Okay. I'll just take a few minutes to introduce our speaker and the lecture series. My name's Anindya Banerjee. I'm the head of Department of Economics. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 12th Peter Sinclair lecture here in Birmingham, including those joining online. As some of you will know, the lectures are in memory of our longtime colleague, Peter Sinclair, who was a professor in our department and sadly passed away in the early months of the COVID pandemic in March 2020, in fact. So this is our 12th lecture. It's held, we usually have 2 lectures per year. And in addition to this annual lecture series, Peter is remembered at Birmingham by his students, of course, his former students. We have undergraduate and postgraduate prizes named after him, as well as a scholarship fund for the PhD, a small fund that he endowed for us. We are very honored today to have with us Andrew Dilnot as our Peter Sinclair lecturer this year. Andrew is the non-executive chair of Oxford University Press. In his very distinguished career, he has been the chair of the Commission on the Funding of Care and Support, which reported in 2011, director of the IFS from 1991 to 2002, principal of St. Hugh's, Oxford, from 2002 to 2012, warden of my old college, Nuffield, from 2012 to 2024, and chair of the UK Stat Authority from 2012 to 2017. More excitingly, he was the founding member of BBC Radio 4 series on the beauty of numbers called More or Less, whose current presenter, Tim Harford, a former student of Peter's, who spoke very movingly of Peter's influence on him, was our first Peter Sinclair lecturer. And among his many honors, Andrew was appointed CBE in the Queen's Birthday Honors List in 2000 and was knighted in 2013, 14, I've forgotten.
I don't know, sometime around then.
For services to economics and economic policy. So we are very, very pleased to welcome Andrew to talk to us today. I will leave the floor to him. I think the plan is to speak for about 45 minutes, leaving time for questions from the floor, and Eric is monitoring the online chat. Please.
Thank you, Anindya. It's great to be here. Thank you to Anindya, to Eric, to all his colleagues who've been great hosts today. I was lucky enough to be taught by Peter Sinclair in either 1979 or 1980. I can't quite remember which. And my wife said to me last night, "Oh, it's the Peter Sinclair lecture tomorrow. Didn't Peter teach you that paper that you completely didn't understand?" And the answer is indeed he did. He taught me the money paper, which I completely didn't understand. I still don't think I really understand money. And I've never had a more generous-spirited and courteous teacher than Peter. There was a particular occasion during the term when, in a fit of undergraduate uselessness, I managed to lose my bag, which had all of my notes. And this is back in the days when we had paper reading lists and paper with what the essay for the next week. So I had to get in touch with Peter, and I couldn't really remember, to my discredit, what the essay was meant to be about. So I was completely lost. So I sent him a note, and he sent me back the most lovely, detailed note with, in his inimitable, small, very neat handwriting, using 3 different colors of pen, a list of the articles I really, really absolutely had to read, then another 10 that it would be helpful to read, and then about 25 that it would be really great to read if I had time. And he seemed to be apologizing to me for the fact that I had lost my bag. And that was just what he was like. I've said to a few people today, I finally found somebody yesterday who was willing to speak ill of him in any way. And it was a colleague in Oxford who said, Peter was wonderful in every way, except when you wanted him to tell you whether somebody or something was good enough, because he simply wasn't able ever to be nasty about somebody. He didn't have a negative bone in his body. He was a generous-spirited, lovely man, and it was a great tragedy for us all that he died so young. Right, now I'm going to talk about data, but economic thinking, and you'll realize, I hope, as we go, I really love data. I really, really, really love data. I quite like representations of data. I'm at pains always in these lectures where they're public to point out that I love my wife and my children and my grandchildren more than I love data, but not by very much more. And I'm going to talk about data and about economics, which I also love with a great passion. I think economics is a fantastic way of thinking about the world. And at their best, the marriage of economic thinking and data can do fantastic things. But to be at their very best, we have to try really, really hard. And it's very easy, if you're working with data, to then be a bit lazy, to think that you've got what you wanted and that's all you need to do. And this is a kind of parable about how that can go wrong, and a parable in which I'm one of the central guilty parties. Let's start. I began work at the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, at the very beginning of the 1980s. And I started working there because I had what was then felt to be some facility with computers. And this was the first data set that I worked on. So this is a data set drawn from a thing called the Family Expenditure Survey for 1977. The Family Expenditure Survey, which no longer exists in the UK, it's been replaced by a thing called the Family Resources Survey. Back then, it used to ask 10,000 households, about 7,000 of them would agree to participate in the survey. Detailed questions about their income, about their expenditure, about their household composition, their ages. So it allowed you to build up a very detailed picture of what was going on. So this is for 1977, and this is the income distribution expressed in 2013 prices, because I'm going to use 2013-14 prices all along. This is the shape of the income distribution. So along the bottom is income in pounds per week. Up the side is numbers of individuals in thousands. So this just shows you that in 1977, the mode was about £180 a week for household income. This is all equivalized as though you're a 2-adult childless household. A bit of a tail, but not a very dense tail. That was fantastic information to have. It took us an enormous amount of effort to generate just that single picture of what the income distribution looked like in that 1 year. And then what we said to ourselves is, oh, but what we really want to know is how this has changed over time. What will be really exciting will be able to know how the income distribution has changed over time. And so at the IFS, we dedicated an enormous amount of resource in the 1980s and the first half of the 1990s to reproducing this information for a run of years that went back to 1961 and up to whatever the present day was. We finally got this work and published it in 1994, but it's gone on since then. And it was quite tricky because this data was stored on computer tapes, and the computer tapes from the early 1960s, we found it quite hard to find anywhere that had a computer where we could read those tapes. And in the end, we found there was a place, and it was the Sainsbury's headquarter in the Mile End Road. So we used to send a man who subsequently became the Minister for Pensions in the coalition government, a man called Steve Webb, who, when he was the pensions minister, was a Lib Dem MP, but at that time was a junior researcher at the IFE. We used to send Steve carrying these computer tapes down to Sainsbury's in the Mile End Road, which is the only place we could read them. And we also used to send him to the Public Records Office, because the original questionnaires were all kept in the Public Records Office in Kew, and there were some corrupt households, corrupt in the sense that their data was corrupt. I'm sure that, yeah. So Steve actually went and got the original written down anyway. So it was quite an effort, and we finally published this in 1994. And of all of the bits of work that happened while I was the director of IFS, I think this was the thing that I was most delighted by, because it meant that we, for the first time, had some understanding of the way that the income distribution has changed. And I'm going to show it to you in a minute. I remember while we were working on this, talking to Tony Atkinson, the great figure in the analysis of the distribution of income and wealth in the UK, and him saying, if we could just have 50 years of data, then, and we both eulogized it. Anyway, so we did it. This is the 1961 distribution. And then it flips every couple of seconds, year by year. You can see not much is changing. This is all in constant prices. It doesn't look as though very much is happening in the 60s to the income distribution. All sorts of other exciting things are happening, but not much to the income distribution. The same is true through the 70s. It's not changing very radically in shape, which was a bit of a surprise to us, but watch what happens starting now, 1984. For economists, that is a pretty radical change. And then through the 90s, not much more changes. It's moving steadily to the right and shifting in shape a little bit, but nothing like that extraordinary rapid change that we saw in the 1980s. I'll run this forward to 2013 and then I'll stop it. So that was what it looked like in 1963. That's what it looked like in 2013. That's a big change. I mean, that is a really, really big change. So what's happened is that the mean and mode and median have all moved up. So we've got better off. There's been significant economic growth. But the shape has changed radically. So we've got a massively thicker tail. The top half of the income distribution has grown in thickness and has moved out. That's a pretty big change. And as I say, not much happened between 1963 and 1973. Not much happened between 1963 and 1983, but then look at what happens next. That's a really significant change in the shape of the income distribution in the second half of the 1980s. And most measures of inequality, which had been stable through the 60s and 70s, then rose very dramatically in the second half of the night, well, from about 84 on, and have been stable since then. So this was, as I say, this was a piece of work that I was incredibly excited about and very proud to have been in some way involved with. But funnily enough, as soon as we'd finished it, we started realizing how inadequate it was to answer many of the questions that we'd wanted to know the answer to. The Family Expenditure Survey asks you detailed information about your income during a 2-week period. Well, that's quite interesting, but it turns out that persistence is really important when you're thinking about what's happening to income. So the sharp-eyed amongst you may have noticed that there was a big increase in the number of people with 0 incomes. Well, we, kind of liberal intelligentsia said, oh, that's shocking, very increase in inequality. So we went and had a look at these people. And we were very puzzled when we looked at them, because it turned out that their consumption, their expenditure, was significantly above the median. And then when we looked in more detail at what they were, there were 2 sorts of people. There were people who were working typically as self-employed people for part of the year, and then taking some of the year off because they made so much money in the part of the year when they were working. And the other was some of you in your vacations. So they were students not earning during the summer vacation, but having high consumption because, well, often because they were being looked after by their parents. So that made us realize that just a 2-week measure of income won't necessarily do it for you. And if, for example, you're interested in inequality or poverty, you need data that takes you over a much longer period. That was one thing that we thought about. The second was, I skated over the fact this is all households. And we assumed, certainly in the early 80s, that a household was a well-defined and stable concept that applied to everybody. Well, it isn't. There are lots of young people now, children in particular, who are members of more than one household because their natural parents are no longer living together. You've got to think about that. There are older adults who may or may not be part of multiple households. It's just thinking about the household unit is not entirely straightforward, and you've got to get that straight. We realized that all of this was measuring income and kind of behaving as though wealth was absent, that all that mattered was the flows of income. And that's clearly wrong. If you're going to know what's going on with people's standard of living, you need to know about wealth they might have. And of course, then we also realized, and that was partly something that we were reminded by when we looked at this lot, that we're only looking at income because it's a relatively easy proxy for the thing we really care about, which is consumption. What we're interested in is what people are consuming, not what they earn. And this is just a measure of income. It's not a measure of consumption. And that's because it's much easier to measure income than consumption. And then the thing that I want to talk about most today is that then led us on to when I say us, what I actually mean is John Kay, who was the person who was the director of the IFS in the early 80s and one of the most extraordinary, brilliant people I've ever worked with. This is only really a part of the economy. This is telling us what's happening to the incomes that people use to buy the things that they consume that they pay for directly. But it tells us nothing about the roads that they drive on, the street lights that they benefit from, the health service that they may or may not be using, but certainly will use if they need it, the education system that has educated them. That is, this is all about the purely private part of the economy. And a large part of the economy is not entirely private in this country. Well, close to half of the economy is absorbed by tax. About a quarter of it now is absorbed by the provision of services that we pay for collectively through taxation. None of that is referenced in this data at all. It's just looking at people's post-tax disposable income. And just as it's very important for us to think about the incidence of all taxes, so who's actually made worse off by income taxes, social security contributions, VAT, corporation taxes, so we also, as economists, should be interested in the incidence of all expenditures, including those that are not directly incurred by individuals. We've got into a terrible muddle here, and I feel partly responsible. During the 1980s and 1990s, when I was at the IFS, we did lots of this distribution analysis. We built models of the British tax and benefit system that meant that on budget day, at the end of the day, we could put up a chart that showed you what was going to happen to the distribution of net income as a result of the budget. But there's something that I think we've been missing, which we did think about in the 1980s and then rather forgot about, and was brought back to my mind about 3 years ago when I saw a story on the BBC News website the day after some budget or autumn statement. And the headline was, "Living standards to continue to fall." And then at the beginning of the third paragraph of the story said, "Living standards will continue to fall because taxes are being raised to increase public spending." And then the penny dropped again. Do we think that public spending destroys living standards? Or do we think that possibly the reason we're doing it is because it's the best way of providing a particular form of consumption or living standards? And I think we have got into a muddle, and I'm afraid it's a muddle that the current government has walked straight into. So if you think about what the 5 objectives of the current government are, this is one of them in their plan for change. Raising living standards in every part of the United Kingdom, an unexceptionable country. So working people have more money in their pocket. Well, that's equating living standards with post-tax disposable income. And that's effectively assuming that the value of health services, education, the police, the defence forces, the road network, in consumption, in living standards, is 0. That's completely, utterly bonkers. It's allowing the fact that we had some good data about a particular thing that's easy to measure. And of course, we could measure post-tax disposable income very easily for everybody in this room. That's a knowable number. What your living standard is, including the value of the things that are provided collectively, is much, much more difficult. But it happens to be the answer to the question we should be asking, rather than an easy answer to a question that is not quite the right question. Now, if the level of collective consumption wasn't changing very much, then we wouldn't have to worry too much about this, because the data we've got on household disposable incomes will be telling us the right answer. So what do you think has been going on to public expenditure as a share of national income around the world? Well, it's been going up, and it's been going up a lot. So this is a chart that starts way back in 1800. You see it through the 19th century. There's not very much state activity, because the principal form of state activity was defence of one sort or other. But through the 20th century, for a whole range of countries, public spending as a share of the economy gradually grows. And it grows from about 10% here at the beginning of the 20th century to, depending on where you are, between 30 and nearly 60%. And there's been a steady, although not monotonic, increase. So those commodities that are provided collectively, paid for out of taxation, they are a really, really important part of consumption, a really, really important part of living standards, and they've been getting bigger. So if we ignore it and we treat living standards as just this part of our economic life, which is readily measurable, which is real household disposable income, we will get things wrong. Now we're going to have a brief digression into GDP components. Now, I have a funny feeling that when you do an undergraduate degree in economics these days, you're not taught much about how GDP is calculated. That could be possibly a good thing. You don't need to know much about it here. So one way of measuring GDP, the size of an economy, is to look at expenditure. And here we've got, starting in 1948, coming up to 2020 over here, the proportion of total GDP that is total expenditure, as opposed to investment. And then this blue line is the proportion that is households using their own money to spend things for their own benefit. And you can see that that proportion has fallen from about 75% in 1948. So about 75% of GDP in 1948 was represented by individual households using money that they had control over to buy goods and services for their own consumption. It's now, if I can find, it's now just over 55%. That is a very big change in the long run. How has that happened? Well, this grey line down at the bottom, which was about 8% in 1948 and about 15% now, that is the part of the economy that is represented by goods like education and healthcare. So private goods being provided publicly. So health and education are not public goods in the sense that they're non-rival and non-excludable. They're goods that could be provided by the private sector, but in this country and many Western countries, they are largely provided by the state. And that's risen from about, as I say, about 8% to about 15%. And then there's another component of what the government does, which is the genuinely public goods. So the defence forces, the police forces, road lighting, road networks, things that it would be very hard to imagine the private sector providing. And that stayed roughly constant. If anything, it's declined slightly. The gap between the top line and 100% is gross domestic fixed capital formation, so investment of one form or another. And that's what you get if you put all of these things on. So if you look just at the GDP components, you're reminded that this thing that we're ignoring when we just look at post-tax disposable income, which is what the government has made one of its objectives, is a significant sum, and a sum that has grown quite a lot. So we clearly shouldn't do it. We shouldn't be ignoring it. Ignoring it makes no sense. Now, India, in his very kind introduction, mentioned that I'd spent some of the last decade or so, a bit more than a decade ago now, looking after the UK Statistics Authority, whose executive arm is the ONS. The ONS does many good things, and has also got into a bit of trouble with some things recently. But one of the things that it does that I'm particularly fond of is it produces an article each year called The Effect of Taxes and Benefits on Household Income, which I commend to you. I will skip over those. And what it does in that article is it takes you through 5 different stages of what you might think is the standard of living of a household. So it starts with original income. And these are averages for the whole population for a year. So on average, the original income of households in the UK, this is for 2023, I think, was a bit more than £45,000. So that original income is made up of wages and salaries, pensions, and investment income. So in some sense, incomes that household has earned in that year. And that's obviously one number that you might think of. The next stage is to add transfer payments made by the state. So pensions, unemployment benefits, child benefits, disability benefits. So these are all paid for by the state, and that takes up to an average of 52. Now, clearly, you can't stop there because that seems to be creating money out of nowhere. So that's made people, on average, £7,000 a year better off. Well, that must come from somewhere. Well, indeed, it has come from somewhere. It's come from direct taxes. So the third stage is to take direct taxes away from people, income tax, social security contributions. And that gets you to this number. And this is the number that is the focus of the government's objective, the focus of almost all media analysis and almost all discussion. You can see that this number is quite a lot lower than that number. So we seem to have disappeared money somewhere. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then the fourth stage would be to look at post-tax income. So this then takes indirect taxes away from people. And there's an interesting question to be had about what we should think about the incidence of indirect taxes. And in this article, what the ONS are doing is essentially assuming that indirect taxes are entirely incident on the consumers. So they're not incident in any way on the producers or the owners. And then the final step, and I think the most interesting one, is to add in a valuation of the goods and services that are provided by the state free at the point of use to consumers. So healthcare, and education being the principal ones. And you'll notice, pleasingly, for those who are destined for a career in accountancy, that the first bar and the last bar are almost exactly the same height, which is what you'd want. I'm absolutely convinced, although it's very difficult to work out precisely how you do this, because working out what the value of healthcare is to an individual is tricky, working out what the value of education to an individual is tricky. But this is clearly what we need to be doing when we're thinking about aggregate living standards. To ignore these things is bonkers. That's for the population as a whole. I want to come on now to one of the reasons I think this is most important. And that is, let's look at what that picture looks like just for the least well-off 20% of the population. So if the least well-off 20% of the population, original income is about £8,000. Social security benefits of one type or another, nearly double that. Not much direct tax is paid by the bottom 20% because many of them are not, don't have incomes high enough to be income taxpayers. Quite a lot of indirect tax is paid by that group. But look at this massive jump that comes from the provision of collective goods. This increase in effective living standards is much larger than this increase. And to ignore it is to miss the most important set of things that we're doing collectively for the least well off. Continues to be true for the second quintile, so for the people in the lowest 20 to 40th range. The jump in their effective living standard as a result of the provision of collective goods is much larger than the jump created by cash benefits. And you can do that all the way through. So the blue bar at the right is the best off 20%. You can see their original income is much, much higher than the others at close to £120,000. They receive very little in the way of social security benefits, small amounts of child benefits, some retirement pension. They pay a lot of tax, so the decline from here to here is much higher for those with high incomes. they don't pay a particularly large amount of indirect tax. They pay more indirect tax than other parts of the income distribution, but not proportionally more. And then they see a small bump up at the end. This, I think, is basically how we should be thinking about the distributional effect of government. But on the whole, we don't, because we don't have anything like such good measures of the impact of the spending. Just to take you through exactly what's going on in the redistribution again. So this looks at those stages. This is the first quintile, second, third, fourth, fifth. So all quintiles gain as we move from original income to gross income. So there are social security benefits paid across the income distribution. You see they are pretty progressive, although it's the second quintile that gets most of them. That's because that's where a lot of the retired are, and most, the bulk of benefits go to retired people. The direct tax system doesn't have a very big effect on the bottom two quintiles, but does have a significant effect at the top. Indirect tax is broadly proportional. And then this contribution to people's living standards through collective provision is most important for those on the lowest incomes, but is still significant for those higher up. I think if we ignore this, we have a completely misconstrued picture of what is going on. If we think that we can use income as a proxy for living standards, then we are in the end deceiving ourselves. And that's particularly problematic if we're in a period when collective provision is likely to rise. And we are. We've been in a period like that for the last 60 or 70 years. In the last 30 or 40 years, the way that governments have dealt with that is they've gone on increasing spending on the things that are providing direct collective provision, and they've tended to reduce investment, and they've tended to cut defence spending. That game has played out. We can't do that anymore. So if we're to go on increasing spending on health and education, for example, we are going to have to pay more tax. And there's a risk that that will be presented as reducing our living standards. Well, is that really very sensible? Why do I think we're going to go on increasing spending on collective provision? Well, this is the single bit of data that probably makes me happiest of all. This is life expectancy over the last 500 years or so. So you see that from the 1500s till the early 19th century, mid-19th century actually, it was 40. Period life expectancy at birth was 40. And now it's 80. I'm much nearer 80 than I'm 40. So this makes me very, very happy. This is genuinely the great triumph of the last 150 years. Many people think that this has happened primarily because of changes in infant mortality. And it's certainly true that changes in infant mortality have played a very large role in this. So you're massively less likely to die under the age of 1 or under the age of 5 or even under the age of 15 than you were. And that's a fantastic transformation. Only 100 years ago, the great bulk of women would have a child die. It's now a very unusual event and a kind of desperately tragic event when it happens. But 100 years ago, every woman was likely to have a child die because there were many more births per woman and the probability of infant mortality was very high. But it isn't just infant mortality that explains why why there are more people around. What this shows is, starting with 1922 and ending up now, the probability of death in the following year by somebody who's aged 80, 65, 0, 45. And this is for women. And you can see that in 1922, if you had a probability of dying of 12% in the following year if you were an 80-year-old woman. And that number is now about 4. It's an astonishing reduction in mortality, and it is affecting all of us. You can also see, which I always particularly struck by, that it wasn't until just after 1960 that you were more likely to die as a 65-year-old woman than you were as a 0 to 1-year-old child. This blue line shows you the reduction in infant mortality. For men, it's even more striking. So it was 14% in 1922 and still 12% in 1960 when I was born. There was still a 12% probability of dying as an 80-year-old man in the following year. And that number is also now down at about 5.5. The particularly dramatic reduction in male mortality here is smoking and drinking, recognizing that smoking killed you and so stopping it. These reductions are fantastic. They're wonderful for human flourishing, which is the object of almost everything that we're doing. They're terrible for the public finances. They're really, really, really bad for the public finances. When this happens, two things happen that are very, very hard for Rachel Reeves. The first is you have to go on paying pensions to them, and that's very expensive. The longer people live, the more pension you have to pay. The second is that the longer people live, the more health output they'll consume. And every time we do something that makes people healthier, ironically, we end up spending more looking after people's health. Because if you die from smoking-related heart disease or lung cancer when you're 58, that's the end. If you don't die from smoking-related lung cancer or heart disease when you're 58 and you live on into your 90s, you're likely in your later years to have multiple quite complicated health challenges, which we can now address. Hooray, it's fantastic, but it's not good for spending on health or indeed for social care, something we won't move on to. What that's meant is that, in particular in health, but it's true in other areas, we've seen very significant growth pretty much every year in health spending. So you go back to the 1950s, public spending on health grew at an average of 2% a year. In the 60s, 4% a year. This is all real. 70s, 4% a year. 80s, a period during which the Conservative government tried to hold health spending down for a while, about 2.5%. There was a bounce back in the 90s, and particularly in the first decade of this century, when very, very significant increases in health spending were put through, mainly because of a backlog from back here and the demographic change. In the 2010s, we tried to hold we held health spending at about 1.8% a year. That is why mainly the health service is under such pressure now. The Health Foundation, which is one of the very good charities working in this area, estimates that the minimum requirement over the next decade will be an increase in spending of 3% a year real. To improve services, we're going to need something like 3.8% real. Now, there was a period, many people here will remember the 1988 budget. In 1988, the Treasury believed that the non-inflationary growth rate in the UK had risen to 2.75%. We don't think the non-inflationary growth rate is 2.75% anymore. We will not get growth in the economy of anything like these figures. A reasonable set of estimates for what will happen over the next decade will be that GDP might grow, if we're lucky, at 1.8 or 1.9%. I don't think anybody is thinking better than that. Tax revenue looks set to grow, if that's how fast the economy grows. Tax revenue might grow at 1.6%. The plans for health spending are for it to grow at 0.8% a year. The average over the post-war period has been 3.6%. These are too plausible. We are not going to hit that. We will definitely spend more on health. That health spending will increase more quickly. If it doesn't, the health service will experience a collapse. We are going to be in a position where I think almost without doubt, we will be paying more tax for the thing that people in this country care about more than anything else. And this will look as though it's making our living standards fall. That is a completely Alice through the looking glass sort of a world. We have to move away from equating living standards with post-tax disposable income. That is not an accurate measure. Living standards are difficult to measure. Post-tax disposable incomes are a really interesting thing to be looking at, but it isn't actually the answer to what Economics 101 would say determines our living standards. Our living standards are determined by what we consume, and we consume quite a lot that we don't pay for directly. this is just one example of the way in which wonderful data can sometimes lead us into sloppy thinking. And as I say, I've in the 45 years of my working life, I've been guilty of that. I have relied too much on looking at analysis of the distribution of the levels of changes in post-tax disposable income. That's really important, but it's not the answer to everything that matters. And there are trends going on at the moment that mean that there is a direct conflict, potentially, between what will be best for people and what will look as though it's best for people. Just imagine a thought experiment where you imagine a country where healthcare is not provided collectively, it's bought privately, and a country where it is provided collectively. And imagine that in both countries there's a demographic transition going on, which means there are an awful lot of older people and health spending is rising. In the country where the health spending is paid for directly, we'll deduce that living standards are rising. In the country where the healthcare is provided collectively, we'll deduce that they're falling. That's a mad world, and it's an example of something where a bit of sloppy thinking has, in our country, led to a government having an objective that isn't very coherent and doesn't make sense. And this is not a left or right point, let me emphasize. I don't have a position on that. There are certainly things that somebody on the right could reasonably suggest we could do about what we spend money on at the moment that would mean that we didn't have to raise taxes to raise spending on health. We could, for example, no longer promise to pay state pensions to relatively affluent people like me. And that could be a way of reducing overall public spending on allowing room for health. So this isn't a left-right point. It's a think about what your objective is. And the thing I'd like to leave ringing in your ears is economics never says anything other than the objective of human life is human flourishing. And the objective of economic analysis is to enable human flourishing. And in this particular area, with this obsession or undue focus on a part of what we consume, we've become confused and we're no longer thinking straight. If we thought straight, we would have a different narrative, and it would be a narrative, in my view, that would give a much clearer articulation of why it might be that we want to do some things collectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll take a mic, I think. The floor is open. Go for it.
Hi. Do you think that in order to be able to measure how the living standards provided by this public expenditure that you've mentioned, that we need some kind of a way to measure its quality and turn it into monetary terms? Because otherwise how should I put it? Just because money is being spent doesn't mean that what's being bought is actually worth buying. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The issues around how you value these goods are very complicated. And so there's been some pretty good work done, again, under the auspices of the Office of National Statistics by Tony Atkinson and a man called Joe Grice, looking at actually measuring public sector productivity. So there are ways that you can do it. The kind of simple intuition is you can, for example, say, well, let's look at outputs of the health service. Let's look at what those outputs might be. They might be hip replacements, they might be consultations, they might be vaccinations. We can attempt to price those, to value those, and that's been done pretty well in the UK. And actually, funnily enough, was one of the reasons why UK GDP seemed to fall more dramatically during COVID than many other countries. Most countries don't attempt to value the output of the public sector. They simply value it at the money that's gone in. And during COVID, the money that went in didn't change very much. But in the UK, in both education and health, because we were measuring outputs, our GDP was shown to fall. And part of the confusion about why our GDP appeared to fall more than other countries was precisely that measurement issue. So yes, I think there are those kinds of measurement issues. There are trickier measurement issues, I think particularly in the case of health, because many of us won't, for many years, be significant consumers of health. So the ONS studies effectively average out across demographic groups. And that probably feels like the right way to do it. An alternative would be to do the thought experiment, what would it cost me privately to insure myself for the same? So another way of doing it is to look at what are the insurance costs would be. Quality is a critical part of all of this, because many of those who end up as consumers of publicly provided goods would think that they had no that there wasn't an obvious counterfactual for them. There wasn't an alternative for them, certainly with tax levels as they are at the moment. And so, in particular, if we thought the quality of a service was extraordinarily low, then we might want to say that its value was less than the cost of the input cost. So yeah, those valuation questions are really important. And of course, they're politically very important too, because one way of thinking about what we're doing in all of this is that we are making collective, after all, we vote for the people who make the decisions about these allocations. We are making a kind of choice, but it's far less easy to do than is in the private sector. So private spending, we change very easily as a result of hundreds of millions of individual decisions. So this is what's happened to the share of household consumption expenditure that goes on food. Yeah, this is food and drink. And so that collapsed simply as we got richer. And this is the same chart for transport. So transport rose very dramatically. It's very easy for us to change the composition of the private part of the economy because it just happens as a result of the public sector. We find it much more difficult to change the composition. But this particularly in a university, this is one that always. So this is the share of GDP that went on health in blue and education in brown. So you see in 1975-6, about here, we were spending about 5.6% of GDP on education and about 4% of GDP on health. We're now spending about 9% of GDP on health, and the latest number on education is 4.2%. But you ask yourself, how can that be what anybody thought was the right idea? We had a prime minister elected here who said that it was education, education, education. And to Tony Blair and his government's credit, you can see that during the time of the Blair-Brown government, there was a substantial increase in education spending as a share of GDP. Since then, it's collapsed. I think this is an aggregation problem. I actually think that the preferences of the population as a whole would have led not to health spending not having increased, but I think we would also have wanted education spending to increase. Surely the income elasticity of demand for education must be greater than one. How on earth has this happened? I think because the democratic process has failed. You see somebody up there? Oh, yeah.
So I'll read out the question on Zoom from Suhani, who asks, what do you think is the most holistic measure of living standards, including things like purchasing power parity, but also non-financial factors like gender equality, crime rates, and so on?
So this may be, I'm not sure where the camera is, probably up there. This may be a slightly frustrating response. I think one of the problems that we're also all prey to is thinking that a number or a measure will do it. I don't think living standards is a single coherent idea. I think it's lots of things. And so I don't think that we shouldn't look at real disposable incomes. I think what's happening to real household disposable income is an important component of that. But I also think the output of public sector service is an important component of that. I think that being concerned about environmental degradation is an important part of that. Being concerned about the quality and nature of the society in which we live is an important part of that. So I think another problem with much of our public debate is it becomes reductive. It wants a number. And even those who recognize there are lots of different components to living standards, often what they then reach for is, oh, let's make a composite index that smudges them all together using entirely arbitrary weights and comes up with a number. And then we can look at a ranking and compare our living standard with the living standards of other countries. I think it's more complicated than that. And I think economists should be open to recognizing there won't always just, there isn't a number. There are lots of indicators that we're interested in. And you'll have noticed I talked a bit about, in the end, I think human flourishing is the thing that we're after. But human flourishing isn't easily reducible to a single measure. So human flourishing, if you're a 92-year-old with dementia, means certain sorts of social care and social and family support being available to you. Human flourishing, if you're a 10-month-old baby, means something altogether different. It's complicated. I think we shouldn't be shy about saying it's complicated, and sometimes a single number won't answer it. But you'll never get anywhere without numbers.
Well, what about government waste? We could reorganize the National Health Service a bit to make it more efficient.
So there's no doubt that absolutely everything that goes on is less than optimally done. And that's true in the private sector as well as the public sector. In the private sector, it is also true there are financial incentives that may mean that certain things will be done more effectively. Certainly in various aspects of our public sector provision, there are things that infuriate everybody who uses them. My own reflection on this after 45 years of looking at bits and pieces of this is that on the whole, of course, it would be massively better if we did everything efficiently, but it's a second order issue. The reason that healthcare expenditure has gone from being 3% of GDP to being 9% of GDP is the massive extension in lifespans and the massively increased opportunities for providing healthcare. I think a good estimate of what we could save if we were maximally efficient in everything that we did might be 20% of everything we did. But we'll never be maximally efficient in everything we do because we're dealing with people. So tackling waste, tackling inefficiency, those are great goals, but they don't take away any of the long run trends that are going on. And just thinking about healthcare, over the next 20 years, the demand for healthcare outputs will double because there are so many people in your and my generation. And I'm so pleased that both of us are alive and are likely to be alive for but that's what's driving the increase in expenditure, not inefficiency. And I don't think the inefficiency is getting any worse.
Another question from online. One from Raffaele over there.
Yeah, two very small points. Sorry. So, two very small points. The first one is redistribution in public service is done through progressive taxation, which is massively distortive. So the size of the pie risks to become smaller and smaller. Output per worker in this country has not been growing since 2006. That's the first one. The second one is a little bit of a provocative thing. I think here this is not just demographic, there is political power. Okay? So people like us vote, my kid doesn't. Somehow the expenditure in my kid's education went down, and that's a political choice. Saying that the demand for health is going to increase and we have to meet that, yeah, it's a political choice.
Yeah. So those two quickly. So first, Raphael makes 2 points. The first is that, of course, to pay for collective provision, we use taxation, and taxation, by changing relative prices, introduces some wedges and introduces distortions. That's unambiguously the case. So let me be clear. I'm not arguing for higher taxation or lower taxation. I'm just arguing that we have to take account of what it is that we're buying with it. At the moment, we're behaving as though what we're buying with it has no value at all, and that's nuts. We might well. So if you're someone who thinks that the damage done by taxation is very high, then there are lots of bits of public sector activity that we might decide to do less of. That's and funnily enough, that could make it look as though we were getting better off. Even so, yes, there are some distortionary effects, and that's important. Is this about? It's about lots of things, and political power is about a lot. Is also a lot about. Funnily enough, I think the main reason this happens is that absolute crises can happen if you're running a hospital, and they don't really happen if you're running a school. So if you're running a hospital, you really can say, as the Secretary of State for Health, you can go to the Treasury and say, if you don't give me some more money, Chancellor, then this hospital in this large city is going to collapse, and that's going to do you an enormous amount of political damage. Whereas if you're the Secretary of State for Education, you can't promise quite such a cataclysm. You can say children with special educational needs are not being adequately provided for in this part of the country. You can say, on average, we're letting down children who are struggling to read, or we're letting down the most able children, but it doesn't cause an absolute crisis. But I bet you're also right that the direct beneficiaries of the most direct beneficiaries of this are not part of the political process, although their parents can be pretty strong advocates too, but it's not working.
Go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
So Arian asks, following on to your answer to a previous question about living standards being made up of many different components, they want to know specifically about how we spend our time, whether that goes into commuting, working, or other things, and in general, our overall sense of control of our own schedules. And if that in some way, directly or indirectly, goes into any measure of living standards.
So it's another very interesting question. And clearly, if you're thinking about the distribution of real household disposable incomes, the answer is no. If you're thinking about human flourishing, the answer will be yes. But that's another order of magnitude more difficult to measure than the value of public outputs. So public outputs, we can begin to think about how we could measure them in ways that will be interpersonally and intertemporally comparable, and even comparable with disposable incomes. How we spend our time, that's much more complicated. And there are some bits of it that we might think we could have a go at using shadow wages, so childcare or care for an elderly relative. But if we're thinking about just, well, are you enjoying your work? How do you feel when you're commuting? I think that becomes not readily comparable with these kinds of money metric things. Doesn't mean it's unimportant, but I would shy away from trying to turn into a money metricized thing something that is essentially normative and subjective, but still, undoubtedly important. I've come to think that the ONS runs a battery of self-assessed normative questions about well-being, anxiety. I think those things are important, but I think they're just different to even what I would like to see as an expanded version of this.
We'll take one more question and then stop.
It seems like public perception of tax is that if it increases, then it seems that people will think their living standards are going down. And also it is a political choice to increase spending on healthcare, but it creates almost like a vicious cycle. People don't want to pay more tax for the healthcare, but they do also complain that, oh, the NHS is struggling. It almost seems like it's difficult to find a solution, especially considering if it's a political choice that the government can choose and they know public perception of tax is not positive. Almost how do we help help the healthcare system, basically?
Yeah. So I think you put that very clearly, and it does go to the heart of it. I think, and it's partly how I started thinking about it all. I think we've lost a sense that what we're doing through the governments that we elect is delivering on the commitments we want to make to ourselves. So I think we've got to a place where it feels as though government is doing things to us instead of acting on our behalf. And so I think some of the language around all of this really matters. And the reason that, aside from feeling a bit guilty that I think we've got into a pickle over how we describe this, I think it matters, because I think if we had a world where we thought about what we were providing collectively as something that we were doing for ourselves, then we would be both particularly cross if we thought that it was being done inefficiently. We would feel that we were responsible, and also cross if there wasn't as much of it as we wanted. So somehow I think we need a way in some language that makes it feel as though this is what it really is, which is collective provision on our behalf. And we're doing it collectively. We've voted to have it done, and we're paying for it. But we seem to have a disconnection between the taxation and the spending, so that it feels as though they're two separate things, whereas in fact, the tax is just the price we're paying for. I mean, it's not just the price that we're paying, but one element of it is it's the price we're paying for the consumption that we're doing collectively. So I think recapturing the notion of what it is that we're doing, which I think economics, why are we doing this collectively? Mainly because it's very hard to see how we could do it privately. So it's true that most of the people in this room could get private health cover, but not all of them could. And as the older people in this room get older, the cost of that private health cover will become prohibitive because the private market failures become very great. So we're doing this partly for efficiency reasons, but also for distributional reasons. We have a health service in most developed countries because we think it's simply wrong that having a severe illness should be more of a problem for somebody who has slight resources than for people who have great resources. But that's a decision that we've taken together. So I think a change of language and less othering of the government, less behaving as though it's the government somehow separate from us that's making these decisions. The government is just a representative of us. It's what we've chosen, or at least in an ideal world, that's what it would be.
Forgive one more question. I know we're short on time, but I think it would be useful to ask this one. It does take us slightly off topic, but since we have some of our students in the room and joining in online, do you enjoy and would you recommend your job? We've talked a lot about what matters in life, what is living standards, and this was a question I thought that was very nice to end with. So
it's a really good question. So the answer to that is, I've always loved my job. My job at the moment, my principal job at the moment, is looking after my 3 grandchildren. I've got a 10-month-old granddaughter and a nearly 4-year-old and 6.5-year-old grandson. And I think of that as being my job at the moment, and it's unbelievably joyful. But for most of my working life, I've had more fun than I can imagine. Working at the IFS for 21 years was just a complete blast. Being able to access data, to have fabulous colleagues, we kind of caught a technological wave. All this stuff was only just becoming possible in the early 80s. It was unbelievably enjoyable. And then having some responsibility for the Stats Authority was great. Radio was great fun. Working in universities, having the chance to see, as many of you teachers do, the transformation between 18-year-olds who arrive often a bit lacking in intellectual self-esteem, a bit gawky, and the kind of astonishing swans who leave 3 or 4 years later was just extremely moving. And I feel as though every part of it has been a privilege. And being an economist, I have loved. I think there is something about the kind of analytical framework that economics gives you that allows you to at least get into some of these issues, and they are very important, and it's very satisfying, and you're very lucky, many of you, to have 50 or 60 years of being an economist ahead of you.
That's a wonderful place to start. Thank you so much, Andrew, for a luminous and very timely lecture, given all the things that Rachel Reeves must be going through. And I hope John Van Reenen and Torsten Bell are advising her properly to do all the right things. One never knows. So thank you, Andrew. And thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Only to say two things. There is a small reception outside, which all of you are welcome to join. And the February edition of this talk will be given by John Vickers, who is Warden of All Souls and has had a long and distinguished career in public service before that. So I hope you'll also come along in February. And we'll keep announcing these, as I say. These happen twice a year, and we very much look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.